Today on With the First Pick, it's time for our pre-draft quarterback rankings. You may have heard of this QB class isn't nearly as deep as last year's, and that's true, but in some ways it makes it more interesting, at least from top to bottom. I'm Ryan Wilson, and help me sort through it all is Danny Kanell, former Florida State quarterback, and with us, producer Claire. And by the way, Claire, if you didn't know, DK won a national title in 1993, led the Giants to the division title in the playoffs in 1997. Claire, were you alive for either of those?
I am sorry to say I was born in 1997.
Okay, so you saw the Giant. You remember that quite well then.
Probably not. I was born in June. Oh, so maybe, yeah.
Jeez, June. All right. Well, I'm older than Danny, so that makes me feel even worse. This is episode 283, and if you keep score at home, Danny, we got 28 days to the 2025 NFL Draft. Thanks for joining us, man. I love talking to you because you're always interesting to talk to, but you're our quarterback guy, too. How are you doing?
I am phenomenal. You give me way too much credit. I was on a team that won a national championship at Florida State. But during that season, I did start one game against Maryland where Charlie Ward was hurt.
Yeah.
And I was the holder. So I take a lot of credit. I did hold the national championship winning kick. And after a couple wide rights previous, I held wide right 2. Because there were 2 wide rights at Florida State before. There was one on my recruiting trip I watched in Tallahassee versus Miami. Then my freshman year, there was a game-winning kick that I held. Laces were out, good hold, missed the kick to lose the game. And then that was such a big deal. Like it was such like this curse for Coach Bowden in Florida State. And we brought in Scott Bentley, who made the cover of Sports Illustrated before he ever kicked a kick in college. And I held the kick that won the national championship. So the third time was the charm. And but yeah, I don't like when players and coaches, for that matter. Somehow recently we started counting national titles for coaches that they weren't the head coach, they were coordinators. I'm like, you don't get credit. And I don't think you get credit for winning a national championship unless you're the starter. There's a couple other big names out there that credit themselves, and they weren't the full-time starter. So I don't take credit.
You don't have to name names, but I always do a double take when I'm watching David Carr as a Super Bowl winner with the Giants.
Exactly.
Hey, man, I would do the same thing. I appreciate Danny not being that guy, but I would do it. Yeah. Hey, man, you still took the Giants to the division title and into the playoffs.
That one I did. That one is true. That is factual. Yes, I did do that. So that was the glory days.
And by the way, before we get going here, I want to say this because we've talked about this before in previous draft cycles. And BMAC has said the same thing. He was a second-round pick. You were drafted in the 4th round. You were angry that you got drafted so late because you had heard differing conversations throughout the draft process. So some of these kids are probably going to be not as happy as perhaps they thought they were going to be, right?
Yeah, it can be like you hear all these great stories and like the documentaries that are made about the hug with Roger Goodell and what a great moment it is. For a lot of guys, that's the case. That was not the case for me. It was agony. That I had probably one of the longest nights of my life was we only had the 2 days. So it was Saturday, Sunday for the NFL draft. First day was 3 rounds. The next day was rounds 4 through 7. And I was realistic. I didn't think I was going to go in the first round. Nobody had really told me that. But in the back of your mind, you're kind of like, man, all it takes is one team.
Yep.
Second round, I thought was reasonable. I thought maybe that was an expectation. And then third round, I was like, there's probably a good chance I'll go then. And then, once you start seeing other guys go off the board and you start falling, and, of course, we've seen the Aaron Rodgers green room fall. This wasn't that. This was multiple rounds over the course of an entire day. And, it was funny because I went golfing that morning with my brothers-in-law. I have 3 brother-in-laws. So we all went golfing. And, I had a phone just in case. But we got home and it was probably the second round had probably just started. So I was kind of like, all right, here's the sweet spot. Let's start watching. And I saw Tony Banks. He was the first quarterback selected that year out of Michigan State. I was like, okay, that's interesting. And, he was a big physical guy. So I was like, all right, it makes sense. But then there was a player named Jeff Lewis that was selected before me. I don't know if you remember that game, out of Northern Arizona.
No.
Who got taken by the Denver Broncos ahead of me. And there were 2 spots that I wanted to go. It was the Miami Dolphins and it was the Denver Broncos because Dan Marino and John Elway was some of my idols at the quarterback position.
Right.
And I didn't, like some of these guys want to go in and start right away as rookies. I didn't start playing football until my junior year of high school. And I only
didn't know
started
that.
2 years at Florida State. I didn't get a redshirt year. So I was kind of green still, even though I played 2 years. I was in no rush. I wanted to go learn from the best, take a couple years, get my feet underneath me. And when both those teams passed over me multiple times, and then I saw the Broncos take another quarterback that I had never heard of, like out of Northern Arizona. I was like, who is this? And
there was no Cover 3 podcast back then for everyone to know who all the players were.
Right, exactly. No one would have had this type of information that you get with the first pick. So I didn't even know. And then Bobby Hoying got taken by the Philadelphia Eagles, and that was another one that I was like, man. So that day, first rounds 1 through 3 go by, and I'm having the conversation with my dad. I'm like, Dad, maybe I should go back to baseball, because I played my first 2 years of college. I was drafted by the Brewers. Like I really loved baseball, and I actually was really bummed and wondering if the NFL was even going to be an option.
Right, because you were.
And then the 4th round got selected in the 131st pick, I think, and finally got the call. And it was still awesome, but it was more of a thank goodness somebody took me. But the other aspect to it is, when you're a 4th round pick, there's no lock you're going to make the team. So it's a little bit more stressful. You don't have as much finance. There's not as much financial reward as a 4th rounder. So it brings in a lot of different aspects to play. You maybe don't get the 2nd and 3rd opportunities that you get as a 1st rounder. There's a lot of implications for a lot of these players. So for all of them, it's not that dream day necessarily. It can be a little bit more agony like it was for me.
And producer Claire, I'll just say this. Danny's one of the most upbeat, positive people I know. So some guys get angry. Like they start taking names and keeping DK receipts, so to speak. But you do that sort of in jest. And you're also a really good baseball player. I think first base and pitcher, right? And you were hitting well north of 90. So that feels like I'd be like, hey, why don't you go play baseball? No one tackles you. You can do it for 20 years.
My dad was kind of like encouraging me. I mean, he was always, he was like, he's like, why don't I still believe to this day I was a better baseball player than football player. Like just as a prospect and what my top side could be. Not saying I would have been an incredible baseball player, because I think baseball is far harder to actually make it to the big leagues. Like in football, it's hard for a 4th rounder, but you have a really good chance of making the team. In baseball, you could be a 1st round pick. You still have to prove yourself at single A, double A, triple A, and you're not only going against, like in college, you're comparing yourself. You have to beat out a lot of other college players to get drafted. In baseball, you have to be beating out the best high school players, the best college players, the best international prospects. And then you actually have to go do it at a minor league level. You can't be a great practice player, which some guys are in the NFL, and they kind of hide on rosters, but they're outstanding in practice. But one day they get an opportunity and they get exposed, and they're not as good as maybe they were in practice. I saw a lot of guys like that, training camp heroes, off-season workout heroes. And you're thinking, this guy looks like a Pro Bowler. And then when the lights come on and the live hitting starts, they completely vanish.
I'm laughing because I played Division I baseball at William & Mary while you were at Florida State. Those are 2 different games, and I was the guy that disappeared. I could not handle pressure. I played middle infield, and by the time I left, I described myself as no field, no hit. I was a mess. And the other thing is, and forget college, but if you're the 2nd round pick in Major League Baseball, it is a grind riding buses every day, single A, making your way and once you get to the big leagues, and one of my buddies at William & Mary played for made the roster for the Atlanta Braves as a free agent, which is wild. He played probably a couple years, and just the grind that the day-to-day 162 major league schedule. That's a lot different than the football schedule we talk about, which is also considered a grind for these guys as well.
So I played minor league baseball for a year with the New
York
Bears, and this was after 5 years in the NFL. So I kind of had a little hiatus in the middle of my career, because I came back later and played in the NFL with the Broncos my last 2 years. But speaking of the grind, there was a 21-day stretch where we had a game every single day, 21 days straight, because there were some rainouts we had to make up. There was a doubleheader sprinkled in there. And thankfully, I played in the league. I played in the Atlantic League, which was independent baseball. And there were a lot of former big leaguers. And our coach was a former big league manager. And so, he was very... We didn't have to ride the bus if we didn't want to, because Pete Incaviglia was on my team. I don't know if you remember Inky. He was a teammate. There were guys. Ruben Sierra was a guy on our team. There were incredible names that played in our league. So he was if you guys want to drive your own, there was a lot of older guys. You could drive. There was a bus, but like a lot of times I might drive with a teammate, take my own car. Like because I had played in the NFL, I had a BMW 7 Series. So it was nice. Like I could cruise, get there a lot faster than the bus could. And I'd grab a teammate or two. They'd want to drive with me because it was a little bit more comfortable than driving in a bus that may or may not have had air conditioning at the time. Like it was there was some Major League the movie aspect to that. So it wasn't quite as bad as the plane they rode in that one. But it was not exactly some of the luxury buses that they have now taking players around.
Before we get too far afield, I'll just say this quickly. I remember one summer I spent in Arizona, and I met a couple of players from the University of Arizona that played baseball. I would imagine your Florida State baseball experience was completely different than what single A baseball looks like in terms of the style and comfort with which you traveled.
Oh, yeah. Dick Howser Stadium is one of the nicer stadiums that are out there. Again, we travel. We didn't go charter like NFL or like college football does. We didn't have our own plane, but we traveled across the country. I went to Hawaii. In fact, I have a great picture from my trip my sophomore year. So it was funny because I was starting to get burned out from trying to play 2 sports in college, but I knew there was this spring break trip, which happened just before spring football started. And we were going to Hawaii. We were going to play against University of Hawaii, and then we were going to play against like University of Hawaii Hilo. There was there were 2 of them. So we played out at the Aloha Bowl. And it just so coincided at the time, it may have been before spring break because it was like February. The Pro Bowl was in town. So we got pictures on the beach in Maui with like the Pro Bowl cheerleaders. And then guess who was playing in the Pro Bowl that came by to talk to his former team and his former coach was one Deion Sanders.
Ah, there it is. Full circle.
Yeah, full circle.
That's why Danny's a pro. That's crazy.
I got a great photo with him too. Me and Mike Martin Jr. posing with Deion, we were in our unis. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, the great Mike Martin. He was your coach at Florida State too, I think, right?
Yeah, he's a legend.
Man, brings like a flood of memories. I used to be so into baseball back then because I wanted to play. I remember all right, 10-second story, then we'll get onto this. I would take my dad out to the field, and he would have the big video VHS recorder to record videos of me taking ground balls and taking BP so I could mail them out in these big packages to college coaches all across the country. Because again, there was no Cover 3 podcast to let you know who was who. Got a lot of thank you, but no thank you letters back. But hey, we all can't be Danny Kanell. That's okay.
One more story for you because it's good. So after I mentioned that 5 years in the NFL, played baseball, and then after making $1,200 a month in minor league baseball, I was like, all right, I got to try to get back to the NFL. Well, it was really hard. So I send out highlight videos to every team via FedEx in a package, like old school. You couldn't email stuff. You couldn't put links. Had to email these, VHS tapes, VCRs, send them to, I didn't send them to all 32, but I bet I sent them to probably 25 of the 32 teams. And I got a lot of letters like you're talking about. Thanks, but no thanks. Probably the most disappointing one for me was I got a letter, and I have some of them. That was actually, I showed my daughter one time. There's one from the Saints that's like, thanks for your interest in joining our coaching staff. I was like, oh, did you not even look at the tape? Like, why would that have to do with it? It was, but there was some beauties in there.
It's crazy, man. It's so crazy. And a lot of the guys that we're about to talk about, and, Zach Wilson just signed with the Dolphins 3 or 4 or 5 years, however long ago. We were talking about him. Okay, this guy has a chance to be truly special, had that great pro day, and you just don't know. But let's start at the top. I'm assuming my number one guy is Cam Ward. I was at his pro day a few days ago, and I'll just say this. Let's see. All right, I was just checking with Brewster Claire what her plans were. I'll just say this. I've been in person the last 2 years to C.J. Stroud, Bryce Young, Will Levis, Anthony Richardson, and then last year was Jaden Daniels and Drake May, and then I saw Kyle McCord earlier this season before I saw Cam Ward. Cam Ward was the best pro day I'd seen in person, Danny, and it may not be close. I think he has just under Anthony Richardson level arm strength, but the ball comes out so quickly. It's like a flick of the wrist. And in person, it reminded me a little bit of vintage Aaron Rodgers in terms of the arm angles and just how easy he throws it. Because when we talked about Will Levis a few years ago, everything felt so tight. And like he was trying to throw 95 every time. And you don't get that from Cam. And he also has an edge to him where he feels unaffected by bad plays. And we've seen him make some insane plays, both good and bad, over the course of last season. He's my QB1, and I don't think there's a little gap between him and Shedeur. I think they're both first-round picks, but I think the Tennessee Titans would be silly not to take him.
I do too. I think he's from a classical perspective. I have to, and I was telling Pete Prisco this the other day on set. Like, I almost have to rewire my brain to where the NFL has really taken a different mindset on quarterbacks. Like, there has been a much more overly aggressive, we'll take a chance on a potential prospect over, historically, probably switched about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. But it used to be like you had to prove it on tape. You had to have multiple years, like, starting experience. I think Bill Parcells even had a rule. He wanted guys with 3 years starting experience. Right. Like, you had to be a certain size. You had to be over 6 feet. And a lot of them was probably more over 6'2" or 6'3". Like, you had to throw the ball a certain amount. Like, there was all these kind of criteria that you had to have, or else you were not going to get picked in the top 15 or possibly the first round. And then we've seen that completely shattered with guys like Anthony Richardson, who start 13 games at Florida, don't have a great completion percentage, are a little bit erratic, but they go, holy crap. Did you see that guy walk in the room? Do you see him run? Do you see him throw? How far he can throw it? It's like, sure, we'll take him in the top 5. Like, we'll take a flyer. And it's whatever you call it, overdrafting, the quarterback needy nature of the NFL where everyone's looking for the next guy. So, like, from a traditional sense, I think Cam Ward is the only one who's really, truly a top 15 pick in this draft.
Yeah.
So, like, from that perspective, I'm like, I totally agree with you. And I haven't seen many guys deviate from that. I think he's in a class by himself. I agree with you on the arm strength. I was in watching him really at Washington State, because Incarnate Word, you see him show up on stats, you kind of start paying attention to him, and then you see, like, he wins the player of the year at the FCS level. It's like, all right. And you're like, well, how good is he? And then at Washington State, you start seeing him make some plays, and it's like, all right, he's got something to it. To where last year, when he was the, transfer portal prize, I wanted Florida State to go after him. Like, I made it clear, like, I was like, this is the best quarterback available that will change your program. And I think that's how I view him coming out in the draft. Like, even with some of these others, and I know we'll get to Shedeur, I think some of them you have to have really good situations around them. And with Cam, I think he's proven he can make stuff out of nothing, which, he lifted up Incarnate Word, lifted up Washington State. He's a game-changing type of quarterback. And then look at what he did for Miami's program. I think that's what sets him apart from everybody else, along with he's probably got the most insane arm talent. He's got the most, like, he's got really kind of crazy playmaking ability, which sometimes gets him in a lot of trouble, which we can discuss some of the downside. But as far as, and I think we've noticed this the last few years, a lot of these quarterbacks, you can tell they grew up watching, you mentioned Aaron Rodgers, but I think they grew up watching Patrick Mahomes. Right. If I was at practice, with even like with Gary Kubiak on the Denver Broncos, and we're going over like our quarterback drops and we're throwing routes, if I would have like slung the ball sideways, he would have been like, what are you doing? Like, come on, let's knock it off. Like, let's go. Get your fundamentals right, Right. And then Cam Ward is showcasing the ability on the, the play now that's gone viral where he's rolling left and kind of flips its sidearm, and yet it's perfectly thrown down the field. Like, no one cares about fundamentals anymore. It's just like, how does the ball get from point A to point B? And even more so, quarterbacks are much more free-flowing, where they're much more aware of arm angles. Like, hey, if there's a defensive end or an edge rusher or a linebacker or a safety coming on a safety blitz, what do I have to do to get it to the receiver? Right. Where I was kind of like, I'm going to throw it the same way, which is so dumb when you think about it. Yeah. And if maybe I would put more touch under the ball, which was bad because that ball's floating in the air. It allows the defender to get there, as opposed to a guy like Cam Ward or Patrick Mahomes. They go underneath the outstretched arms, and it still has the same velocity, gets to the receiver quicker, and it makes way more sense. So, like, he does all that, and I think it's clear some of these younger quarterbacks watch guys like Patrick Mahomes, and it's just second nature. They almost train to make throws that are crazy, may look wild and improvised on tape. They actually do those in practice.
Right. In much the same way, once Odell Beckham started doing the one-handed catches and all the kids started doing that in practice, and then it shows up. It's not out of the ordinary. Cam has some baseball in his background. He actually talked to, I our newest colleague, Rand Carthon, former Titans GM, about it when they after the pro day, and that's worth a listen if you haven't heard that yet or seen that yet. It's on CBSSports.com. You can find it there. But I want to ask you about something you touched on, and this is something that I talked about with Caleb Williams last year. Ton of hero ball at USC, partly because he had to, partly because that's his game. And it probably took 2/3 of the NFL season for him to get that out of his system. Now, the Bears working through some other issues. They fired their coach and all that. How do you coach that out of someone like Cam, who you want to find the right balance? You don't want to make him a robot, but you also can't be running around 5 seconds behind the line of scrimmage in the NFL because you'll get killed.
So I think we're watching it unfold with Caleb Williams, that process sometimes can be a little bit painful. And it's, you make those mistakes and it can really, start to become a detriment to your team, and they start to be much more glaring. And I would say Caleb wasn't as careless, at least it didn't show up in the turnover column the way it did with Cam. Like, he didn't have as many costly interceptions and pick sixes the way that Cam did at Miami. Like, there were a couple really, like, and they're all, I don't know if their
Cal game was a terrible interception.
Yes. I mean, he's throwing back across his body. The ball's floating in the air. And he's got some of those. Like, you can make a highlight reel of those. But I would say this. I would much rather have that than a check down Charlie. Yeah. Or a guy who's waiting. And I would have been in that category. I was safe and playing it conservative and don't turn the ball over and, do whatever. It's like and it's harder. I thought it's harder to coach somebody like that. Say, hey, because first of all, you don't know if they can make the big throws because they're taking a lot of the checkdowns, and the only throws they're making down the field are when their feet are set and the pocket's clean and you can take those shots. Well, now as we've seen the game evolve, a lot of the game-changing throws are made off the cuff, like when the play is broken.
Right.
So I'd rather have that, but I do think it's a formula. It's a risk-reward equation that every quarterback has to learn. And some guys figure it out sooner rather than later. I'm sure that's what Bears fans want Caleb to kind of rein some of that in and start making better decisions from the pocket. Other ones, like a Jaden Daniels, he comes in and starts flourishing right away. CJ Stroud was pretty good with the football his rookie year. But I do think that is something that Cam could be a little bit more of a closer to Caleb Williams, where it's a little bit more of a painful process. But you just have to realize you take the good with the bad, and you try to coach him out of that and explain to him, like, you're not at Washington State or Incarnate Word anymore. And even at Miami, I'm sure they had that conversation with them. Like, hey, we got a really good defense. Well, actually they didn't. So he didn't have that luxury, but you have to kind of tell him, you don't have to make the big play every single down. Like, it's okay to check the ball down or take a sack or throw it away. Because teams are going to, test his patience if somebody who is a big play, explosive making player.
And he got better over the course of the season, I think, about playing on time, but that's probably because of those conversations you're talking about. And Caleb, we'll see. Ben Johnson's probably going to help Caleb Williams a lot. Cliff Kingsbury was the exact right fit for Jaden Daniels, Sean Payton, Bo Nix. So I think Brian Callahan has a track record of working with quarterbacks young and old and getting the most out of them. So I think that's in his favor, and they did sign some offensive linemen. So it'll help us well. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about some more of these quarterbacks in this class right after this.
Guys, can you feel it? Legends were born here. History was made here. These are hallowed grounds.
Hallowed grounds? The NCIS squad room?
Well, I wasn't talking about that, but I was talking about Augusta National.
All right. It's finally time for the Masters. I hear it's a tradition unlike any other.
So, Danny, our buddy Pete Prisco, who you mentioned before, often makes fun of me for falling in love with these players, and I plead guilty. So throughout the course of the fall and even up until probably the Miami Pro Day, if I were to rank last year's draft class and this year's draft class, it would have been Caleb, Jaden, Drake, and then probably Cam or Michael Penix Jr. I like Michael Penix Jr. a little bit more than some more people. J.J. McCarthy, probably Shedeur, and then Bo Nix. I thought Bo Nix was probably a second-round pick. I mean, you had to grow a beard, so you weren't on the first-round train either.
That's right.
Now, after the totality of Cam, in terms of the pre-draft process and what he did in the fall, it's Caleb, Jaden. I think I have Cam third because I didn't love Drake coming out last year. I thought he had a tough season in 2023. Had a great season for the Patriots as a rookie. I'll ask you quickly, if you had to draft, where would you rank Cam in that group? And then we'll talk about Shedeur.
I would probably put him. I still think Caleb is, the year that he had, whatever. I still think he was a prospect coming out that looked, pretty clean. It was like, all right, this makes a lot of sense.
Right.
I'd probably have him. I know we're going to discuss this, but I'd probably have him at like 2A, 2B with Jaden because I do think the skill set. Although, you know what? I was in love with Drake May. Like you were in love with some of your. I might have had Drake May too at the time and might have stuck with that if they were all. We hadn't seen what they become.
Right.
So I might have had Drake May slightly above.
Okay.
And then I would put Cam Ward as kind of a comp with Jaden Daniels and what he could possibly do for a franchise, given the right system and the right coordinator.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about Shedeur. And you hinted at it earlier, and this is the reason I have Shedeur. And you talked about top 15 Cam only. I have my top 100 is going to come out next week. I have Cam as my number 6 prospect. I have Shedeur as my number 24. So he's just outside the top 15. He's a first-round pick. Because teams need quarterbacks, and I think the what he did at Jackson State in Colorado is incredibly impressive. But the differences are this, and this is sort of the Josh Allen versus Joe Burrow conversation coming out, for example, and that their way you have to help Joe Burrow because he is not Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson physically. Now he's sort of morphed into that, which is another fun story to talk about. But Shedeur's a little bit smaller. He's not the athlete, doesn't have the arm strength of Cam Ward. And he's still a really good football player, and I love his tape, and I think he's a first-round pick. But that's just reality. When teams are stacking these quarterbacks, those are the conversations that you have to have. And you talked about that's why you have to surround whoever the quarterback is to make up for those shortcomings physically or whatever they may be. And that's why I have Shedeur ranked a little bit lower than Cam. But if I'm a QB-needy team, I'm taking him in the first round.
So I think he's closer to Jaxson Dart than he is to Cam Ward as far as like where they fall in like the comp and how close they could be. I think he's the highest football IQ of this class. You can tell he's been around the game. You can tell he played for Pat Shurmur, who's an NFL, former NFL coach and offensive mind. I think he knows where to go with the football. I think he's sort of fits a lot of that mentality that's old school. Like he's played a lot of football. He's got great tape. He's laid it all down. The only issue I have with Shedeur is I just wonder if he's tapped, like if he's maximized everywhere he's been, because he's a really hard worker. Like I think he's maximized his potential. So how much more is left for him to go up? And in an era where we're always looking for upside, like who's going to be that, where can you project to be so much better? I don't know, like if he's got much, you can't really, it's hard to develop arm strength. It's too hard to develop more mobility or athleticism. Where like I think even Joe Burrow is a better athlete in the pocket and a better scrambler than Shedeur. Now Shedeur does have a knack for getting out of trouble. Like he avoids but it's not quick, but he has a knack for getting out of trouble. But he does hang on the football a long time. Like sometimes I wonder when I'm watching Shedeur play if he's almost thinking about his statistics. Like, hey, I want to make sure I want to keep my completion percentage high. Like I'm not going to just throw it down the field. I'll just take a sack. And he has no problem like coming back on second 20. And guess what he does on second 20? A lot of times he gets him back and gets the first down the next time. But like there's a luxury of being able to do that in college, where the NFL, you can't take so many sacks. Like you just can't. I think he's the type of guy who, like, best case, a similarity that I think, because if you think of a guy who wasn't that mobile, but didn't have a great arm, but had an incredible Hall of Fame career, it's a guy like Drew Brees. Threw it a lot, played a ton of college football at Purdue, was a pocket passer who could pick you apart with his mind and with his ability to anticipate and accuracy. I think that's like the best case. On like a lower, like what could it, like a floor? I do think there's a pretty good floor with Shedeur, but I do think you have to put him in a good situation. It'd be kind of like a Kirk Cousins. Again, more of a pocket passer, wins with his mind, accurate, gets rid of the football, doesn't have a cannon for an arm. If you put him in a good system, like, yeah, he can succeed. So that, or, like, I think those are kind of where I see him going. Like if he's going to succeed, I do think he needs like a good offensive line and needs a good run game. I have zero concerns. I know a lot has been made, and it's because of his last name, because of his zero concerns about character or work ethic. Everything I've heard and everything I've really watched, because if you pay attention, he works hard. Like prepares hard. He's been raised the right way of how to be a professional. So like I have zero concerns about, you hear about the interview process. I think maybe some of it's just misunderstood, but I have zero concerns about that. My only concern with Shedeur is how much upside is there,
Yeah.
for what it means at the next level.
I was talking to Jimmy Hornets, wide receiver at the Shrine Bowl, and he was applauding in many ways what you're talking about with Shedeur, the player, because offensive line got better at Colorado last year, but there were still some situations where Shedeur was taking a beating. And he said every single time Shedeur got knocked down, he got up, went back to the huddle, and called the play. Body language wasn't bad. He wasn't pointing at people. He wasn't barking at people. He was just out there making plays. And I think that translates because you're going to take a lot of hits in the NFL as well. And if you're able to keep your head up, because we've seen some of these young quarterbacks when their head drops because they're not used to failure, in many ways it feels like it's over. Look, man, if you told an NFL team you're going to get somewhere between Drew Brees and Kirk Cousins,
right? Sign me up.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Right. Which I do think why probably he will be the second quarterback taken and why he probably will be a top 15 pick. Because I do think,
100%. And I often think about it in terms of me as a Steelers fan. If the Steelers sitting there at 21, should they trade up 5 or 6 spots for Shedeur? Yeah, they should. I
think he'd be a really good fit in Pittsburgh too.
The offensive line should be better, and he throws a fantastic deep ball too. You talked about his football IQ. He has. I think the touch on deep ball is better than Cam's at time. But again, the spot fit matters, and that matters for Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix, and it matters for Shedeur Sanders as well. All right, let's talk about Jaxson Dart, who you just alluded to. I like Jaxson. He's a tough kid. You talked to all his teammates at Ole Miss, and we talked to a handful of them through the pre-draft process, and they couldn't say enough good things about him. I don't know if I have him as a second-round pick, and this is not meant to be disrespectful, but I think he's a souped-up version of what Kenny Pickett was, who was drafted 20th overall a few years ago, and that there's also that ceiling that we're talking about. A team might take him in the first round, and that's fine. I get it. But I don't love him as much as what I feel like some other media folks are talking about.
So I had not heard the Kenny Pickett comp, but I do think that's a really good one. I think he probably has a little bit of a stronger arm.
Yes, absolutely.
But Kenny Pickett was like a pretty good athlete. And I think I think Jaxson Dart's a pretty good athlete. I think he's a pretty good runner. What I love about him is I do think you've seen a quarterback who he's endured a lot of criticism. Like he's had to hold off other quarterbacks in quarterback battles. I love a guy who you've seen improve every year. Like, and maybe that's more like Shedeur came in, he played really good, and he's been pretty consistent the whole time.
Yep.
That's why I worry about being tapped. But he got better every single year at Ole Miss, was very young and immature, transfers in from USC, and he kind of struggles his first year in the SEC, then gets a little bit better. From a leadership standpoint, I think he's done that, played against great competition, been pretty good with the football. I guess the one knock you could have against him is that playing in a system with Lane Kiffin that he's in charge of, it has been really good for quarterbacks. And I clearly think he's one of those QBs that, much like Kenny Pickett needed and didn't get, I think situation, fit, surrounding is going to be huge for him. But I do think, I think he has a better top-tier arm than Shedeur, and I think he's a little bit more mobile than Shedeur.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I'm not trying to disparage neither Kenny nor Jaxson. I'm just trying to get a feel for what it's going to look like if the fit isn't right at the next level. We talked to him at the combine, and he's a great guy. And like I said, there's no one tougher. The Georgia game where it felt like his foot was going to come off, went to the locker room, got wrapped up, came back out, and toughed it out. That resonates with your teammates, and his teammates certainly couldn't talk about that enough. But I'll ask you this: do you think he goes in the first round?
10 years ago, no chance. Like current environment, yeah. Like if you set it at 2.5 for the total quarterbacks to go, I would go over. If you set it at 3.5, I would go under, because I don't think we're getting 4 any chance.
All right. Well, I'll read you the rest of my top 5, and then I'm going to throw some names out at you, and you tell me if how high or low these guys could go. So Cam, Shedeur, and Jaxson Dart are my top 3. I think only 2 go in the first round. I think Jackson's a second-round pick for me. I'm a huge Kyle McCord supporter. I love what he did. You talked about check down Charlie at Ohio State. I think he was so afraid, series to series, of losing his job. And then Fran Brown at Syracuse said, "Man, I don't care what happens. Just go out there and sling it." And he slung it. I have him slightly above Jalen Milroe. That may anger some people. I'm fine with that. And then I think I was at Will Howard's pro day yesterday at Ohio State. I think Will Howard's going to be a day 2 pick. Mm-hmm. He's every bit 6'4", 230. He was standing next to Jack Sawyer, the edge rusher. And if they didn't have names in the back of their shirts, Danny, I would not have been able to tell them apart physically. And I thought the way he helped himself down the stretch was incredibly good for his draft stock. I have him just ahead of Quinn Ewers. And the last thing I'll mention before we sort of circle back here is Louisville's Tyler Shuck, who I know a lot of teams like. I don't get the Tyler Shough stuff. And again, Tyler Shough, the person, is probably fantastic. I just mean the football player and taking him top 50. I can't do the math on how that would make sense. But I'll give you the floor about any of these guys you want to highlight.
So one that kind of slipped in there, and it's no surprise, was Jalen Milroe. I honestly have no idea what to do with him. And I've heard other people say, he's the biggest wild card. I agree. He goes out there, runs 4.4. I don't think he's a natural quarterback. And I don't know, try to find a comp. I don't know if there is one. People have tried to say Jalen Hurts.
Yeah.
Jalen Hurts was an accomplished passer coming out of college. When he went to Oklahoma, and he was a better runner. He threw for 3,000, threw for 1,000, threw for 3,000, ran for 1,000 at Oklahoma. It may have been more. It would think maybe 1,400. He was a 5,000 total yard machine at Oklahoma, and he really developed himself as a passer. Milroe is a very, very raw. He's not a naturally accurate quarterback.
You know what I like to say, Danny? I was hoping to see more in Kalen DeBoer's system, and much the same way we saw Michael Penix translate from Indiana, where he was an athlete, to a pure pocket passer.
Exactly. And the fact that he didn't has me concerned. So I just, for me, and the type of system I would want to run, I wouldn't touch it. I wouldn't, unless you're really going to have him be part of some sort of, maybe it's a package that's just built for him, but I don't think he's a franchise quarterback unless you build a very kind of gimmicky offense around. And I don't think I think the Eagles have a system that benefits Jalen Hurts and leans into his running capabilities, but I don't think it's gimmicky. Right. I think you almost have to be gimmicky with Jalen.
And to follow up on that, people try to knock Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson played in pro style offense.
Yeah.
He's a pro style quarterback. So that's not even a comparable. That's not a comparison to make either. It's funny because the sort of the ebbs and flows of our quarterback conversation from the draft perspective, especially in the fall, is when you watch that Georgia game with Jalen Milroe, okay, he's better than Anthony Richardson coming out. This is going to be special. And then there were a lot of bumps on the road after that. Part of me, and this is just me selfishly, and I say this about a lot of these players, I wish he had come back just to see what Kalen 2 years would have looked like with him.
Or somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because I don't know. Maybe what Kalen DeBoer was doing, was asking him to do, just wasn't a good fit for whatever reason. Might have fit great for Penix. And I think financially he would have made more money, because I don't know where he's going to get picked. We'll see. And he's a great kid, a great young man, incredible leadership qualities, teammate, all of that. Quinn Ewers is sort of another wild card for me a little bit, because with him, I love the fact that he's won, he's been a winner, but the injury factor is very real. And that's very similar with him and Tyler Shough. Now, Tyler Shough is one who I almost would have a do not touch.
Interesting.
He has not played one complete season, and it was pretty good, but there have been too much of a history. And I don't think it's anything calling somebody soft. I think it's just some guys' bodies aren't made for football, the sport of football. And for whatever reason, maybe they're just bad luck. That could be it too. But I would just say, you know what? There's too much of a history there. And there's not enough film of him consistently, showing up on the big stage and being able to win games over a period of time. He's had windows. He played really good in some games last year for Louisville, but I just didn't see enough from him to be it's worth the risk for me. But Quinn Ewers, so I actually like the way he was. He came back, and there was a lot of speculation. We had it on the Cover 3 pod so much of the year. What is wrong with Quinn Ewers? Is it mental? Is it physical with the oblique? Is it something off with him? Did Sark lose confidence? Then you find out after the season, and of course there could be some damage control here from Texas and from his agent, kind of letting everybody know that oblique injury was way more serious than we let on. But he was also out there playing with what looked like a ski boot on his ankle,
right,
which he had played. So, again, it's not a physical issue or, a toughness issue, because I think he's one of the tougher quarterbacks that's out there, but it's a, durability issue. But at least he did have multiple seasons that he finished. And in some of the biggest stages, I was at Michigan when Texas went to Michigan this year, and that was before
a great game.
That was before he hurt his oblique. And I sent out a tweet, and it was one of those overreactionary ones that you do during a game. I said, Quinn Ewers just played the number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft.
That wasn't an overreaction. That was how he played.
He played awesome. The year before that, he goes into Alabama, makes some, 3 touchdowns against Bama. This was good Bama, like with Nick Saban, beats them in Tuscaloosa, which not a lot of quarterbacks have done. So like he stepped up and made big plays. This year, his kind of legacy is on the line versus Arizona State. Steps up in a huge monster situation. Was the 4th down? It was 3rd down or 4th down. I forget.
I think it was it might have been
4th down. Like game on the line, beautiful throw, like everything's on the line. So like I've seen a player who stepped up in clutch situations against the best competition. And I do think his arm strength was impacted by his oblique and his injuries. But I do think there's a risk there. That's why I don't think he's in the conversation for the top 3. But I like him a lot. Like, if he's put in the right situation, I think he could be somebody who might be one of the surprises that goes in the 3rd, and he's like a starter one day. And because he was the number 1 quarterback coming out of high school. Like, he's got some arm talent. We just didn't get to see it this past season.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you said. And one of the things that our buddy Rick Spielman used to say all the time is that guys who are injured typically stay injured. And that's the concern. If we knew that Quinn was going to be healthy, he's a top 50, a top 40 pick, because there's no one, a few guys tougher than he is. And Rand Carthon made this point the other day, and I think it's actually sort of piggybacking on what you're talking about. The injury forced him to be better in terms of touch throws, and we saw that. Like, he can do that, but I wanted to see him drive the ball more, because all I heard about a couple of years ago was that he has this big arm, and I felt like I never really got a chance to see it, in part because he was banged up all the time. But he does feel like a 4th-round pick who could get drafted and be a 5 or 6 year starter.
Yes, and I saw him, the SEC championship game against Georgia. He had 2 picks, both to the right side of the field, and both throws looked a little bit like they were floating a little bit. And he missed to the inside, which tells me like he was impacted. Something was going on.
All right, let's talk about my guy. We'll talk about these guys together. My guy Kyle McCord, because I live in Syracuse, and it was so much fun watching them. I had no expectations. I actually asked Kyle the Shrine Bowl. He said, "Yeah, I took a leap of faith coming to Syracuse because he's now big fish in little pond, whereas at Columbus, obviously, there's a lot of pressure." And the guy that replaced him, Will Howard, his stats weren't great at Kansas State, by the way. He completed like 59% and then 61% of his passes the last 2022, 2023. They were okay. And I think there were a lot of question marks around him, to the point where, and you guys probably talked about this in Cover 3, Buckeyes fans were angry that Kyle McCord had left because Will Howard wasn't exactly setting the world on fire for the last month or so of the season. But I thought, outside of Cam Ward, probably the quarterback position, no one helped themselves more than Kyle McCord, who would have been undrafted a year ago and who now has a chance to be probably maybe 4th, 5th-round pick. I would take him probably late day 2.
Will Howard's one to me who I like him probably more than most. Like, I have him ahead of Tyler Shuck. I think some people love the Tyler Shuck upside. A couple things, like he's a big physical kid that can endure anything. But one of the things, my favorite things about Will Howard is the mental toughness. Like, that is one aspect. And I think Shedeur really passes this test too, because Shedeur's been under a crucible since he's stepped on a football field, having to fill, the last name and having to step up and be Shedeur Sanders. Will Howard goes to Ohio State, as you mentioned, coming off that Oregon game where they lose because he slides and there's no time left, and it kind of looks like a boneheaded move, even though I don't think it was that egregious. But there were, this is one of the most pressure-packed positions, being the quarterback at Ohio State. So much so that Kyle McCord was like, "See ya, I'm out of here." And I thought he was one of the more underappreciated players in all of college football this last season, because if you look at what he did on the season, like throwing for 4,000 yards, completing over 70%, like it was, Heisman worthy.
Yeah.
But you had Jeremiah Smith, you had Ibuka, you had Travion Henderson, you had incredible talent all around you. He really didn't get that much credit for it. But I do think he stepped up. I mean, he went toe-to-toe with Dillon Gabriel in that game, throwing the football against Oregon on the road, stepped up on the big stage. And I do think he's an underrated runner, and I think he's an underrated passer. Like, I think he's just flying under the radar. I think he's like, again, more like prototypical big-bodied quarterback for the NFL. So, and I think mentally he's got what it takes, because there are a lot of quarterbacks, if you give them good situations, sure, they'll win. But the minute you face adversity, they can't bounce back. He's been under a lot of pressure, been able to bounce back from that adversity. Again, losing to Michigan, the amount of pressure that was on Will Howard, like entering in to the playoffs, like, hey, your coach is going to get fired. You transferred here, and he steps up with a performance against Tennessee, which was really strong. Like, the bounce back was phenomenal. So I think he's one of those quarterbacks that I think I would see. Like, when I had this conversation with Pete the other day, I asked him, and I'll ask you the same question. Would you rather have Jaxson Dart late first round or Will Howard in the third round.
I'm with you. I'm a Will Howard fan. I would lean towards Will because you're getting something else
Value.
off the team earlier on.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
you're like, and from the value standpoint, like, sure, let him drop to my lap, which can be risky because what if he doesn't drop and you can't miss out on anybody? But there are some of the quarterbacks lower level, like I like them more from a standpoint of the value in the third round than a first round stretch where the expectations are you're going to have to play right away. It just kind of puts you in a tough spot from the get-go.
I agree. All right, let's take one more quick break, and then we'll wrap this thing up with a couple more names. I'll throw it at Danny, see what he thinks. We'll talk about that right after this.
Yeah, we always find our way back home.
All right, Danny, let's wrap this thing up with a couple of the quarterbacks that we should talk about in terms of how media views them and how they're going to end up getting drafted. Let's start with Notre Dame's Riley Leonard, then Dillon Gabriel. And I know our Mike Renner loves Dillon Gabriel to the tune of day 2, possibly. We talked to him at the Combine. And so, Claire, a couple of years ago, Danny and I talked to CJ Stroud, and Danny completely changed his opinion about who CJ was as a person because he was fantastic. That's how I felt about Dillon Gabriel. The difference is that Dillon's 5'10". He's my height. Yes. And Mike might love him, and I understand why. But I know some teams think he might not get drafted. And that's just realistic. What happens when you're 5'10" in the NFL? Because I'll just say this quickly. We did a podcast with Kyle Long the other day, talk offensive line, and I didn't realize how big he was. He makes you look like my size.
Oh, yeah.
He's enormous. And I'm thinking, there's no way Dillon Gabriel can see behind 5 Kyle Longs trying to push the ball down the field. So I'll give you the floor. Dillon Gabriel and Riley Leonard, who are 2 different players, but who will be probably drafted somewhere on day 3, hopefully.
So Riley Leonard is a slower version of Jalen Milroe to me.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he's not a really good passer of the football. He's not a very natural thrower. And I would maybe make a case that some of his misses, it's inexplicable. Like, he'll try to jump throw and the ball bounces in the dirt. He kind of airmails them. Again, I interviewed him a couple times. He may be one of my favorite interviews. He's got this naivete, like this innocence about him. Great kid. But I just don't see him as a franchise quarterback ever. Like, I would view him almost more in that Taysom Hill kind of role.
Yeah.
Like, but that takes a very unique franchise to take a risk on you and to build a package around you like that. So I don't think he's a good enough thrower consistently to be.
I think Taysom Hill was probably a better passer coming out of BYU.
Yeah, he definitely was. I know his stats were better because he threw the ball more. Like, you could tell there were some limitations. I mean, look what happened when he got hurt in the second quarter of the Orange Bowl. They came in with their backup, Steve Angeli, and he threw it like 7 of 8 and was like, where's this passing offense been all year?
Right.
Like, that to me was a little bit of indictment. Again, he's a credible kid. He's really athletic. I just don't think he's a natural passer. Dillon Gabriel, you know who I think he is? I think he's Kellen Moore.
That's
like
funny.
Kellen Moore had an incredible career at Boise State, was one of the best college quarterbacks of all time, which Dillon Gabriel is one of the most. There's some controversy because he played a lot of football.
He did get
extra time, but it's not only the 5'10", and he's a great kid. We met him at Indianapolis at the Big Ten Media Days leading into the season. Love him, but the arm strength just isn't there either. You talk about a blooping ball flight. Like, it's kind of reminds Danny Werfel is another one who was a great college quarterback, just doesn't have that top tier arm strength. And like, I think he probably gets drafted in the 6th or 7th round.
Yeah.
I think he makes a team. I think he'd be great in the locker room. I don't even know if he wants to be a coach. If he does, I think he'd be a great coach one day because clearly he's got a great football mind. He's made some of the greatest throws. But there's a reason Oklahoma let him go to Oregon. Or Oklahoma could have kept him and paid him, match the money for Oregon. They wanted more deep throws. They wanted more consistency in the big play ball, big play downfield. His arm just doesn't jump out to you at all. And if anything, I think it's more of a liability than a strength.
That's funny. I thought his arm strength got better over the course of his career. I mean, he started at UCF, and when we talked to our buddy Lee J. Doosville, who played at UCF, he wasn't high on Dillon at that point. And I think, to your point, he got to Oklahoma and then made his way to Oregon. And there were some rough patches early on in Oregon. Like, it wasn't a seamless transition from Bo Nix, who's another guy who's an example of going from one school to another and sort of finding his place. But I think you're right. It's just a physical limitation, spare or not. And, like I said, and you just echoed, he's a great kid, man. I had so much fun talking to him. And he said, if teams don't want a 5'10" quarterback. That's cool. I don't want to play for a team that doesn't want a 5'10" quarterback. And, Tez Johnson, couldn't speak highly enough of him. Josh Connerly, couldn't speak highly enough of him, his former teammates at Oregon. It's just a matter of what realistically happens when you get to the NFL and the expectations aren't being met. And
there are certain throws that you have to make.
Right.
A bang 8, glance, whatever you want to call it, that kind of 5 steps, no hitch, rip it right up the seam to a post. Some of those middle go routes when you're running 4 verticals and you got to rip one of them up the seam and it's got to be caught, on stride. They just bloop a little bit too much. And in, closing speed of NFL safeties and defensive backs is way faster than it is in college. You can win with anticipation and getting it out early and, kind of floating it to a certain spot, throwing it to a spot. But there are certain throws you got to be able to rip at certain times, especially in today's game. I think he comes up a little short on those too much.
All right, last thing. I'll follow up on that, then we'll get out of here. Tua talking about lower throws with probably better anticipation than anyone. Doesn't have a big arm. That's not Dillon's game. Dillon's not an anticipatory thrower.
Right.
And the other issue is when the offense isn't clicking, when everyone is on the same page, some of those Tua incompletion/interceptions look terrible just because he has to throw with so much anticipation. And the other thing I wanted to mention, you talk about the glance routes. Can Dillon at 5'10" see the receiver on those routes?
Some of the stuff with vision, I think, is a little bit overplayed.
Okay.
Like, again, Drew Brees was not that tall. More of it's about seeing windows. Because look, none of us, and Peyton Manning included, 6'5". Like when you put a helmet on Kyle Long, think about it. So they kind of dip down, they get in their stance, and then think about it. Like, I wish people could have virtual reality where you could see from a pockets, and they probably have it somewhere. But like they do, like the tackles kick out, so you kind of have to slide and you kind of have to see. And sometimes you'll see a space and you can't see things directly. Sometimes you can't see anything. You just have to kind of trust the route. And you have a picture of the overall picture of the defense. This is like really advanced level. When you get to that level as a QB, you kind of know where people are supposed to be.
Right.
And so you're like, all right, there can't be any defender in that space. So I'm going to throw it there, even though I can't see it. But you have to be an exceptional mind and then you have to have the accuracy and the anticipation to throw it there. So like the vision stuff, yes, it does become an issue because it does impact you somewhat, but sometimes I think it's overblown too. But you have to be a very, very, like Kyler Murray, like look at what he's an insanely athletic quarterback. Yeah. And he'd talk about being able to move around and get twitchy and find those windows, maybe one of the better ones at it. That's why he doesn't need to watch any film, Ryan.
That's the other thing. Here's my list that I've had since the fall. Bryce Young, Kyler Murray, Russ Wilson. That's it for QBs under 6 feet. Right. And only 2 of those guys are first-round picks. And Bryce Young looked like he was going to be out of the league until he had What's
Baker? Was Baker 6'1"?
Baker must have been, because he must have been right at 6 or just
I remember he was like on the bubble, but he's not exactly a tall guy, and he makes
it
work.
That's right.
Yeah.
But and he didn't make the cut for under 6 feet, so he's just north of that. But at the very bottom of the list here, Kellen Moore. So
there you go.
Yeah.
All
right. That's it. That's a wrap on episode 238. Danny, thanks so much for joining us, man. This was great, incredibly insightful. Got to talk about the players, but I like hearing your insights as a quarterback. That's stuff that I wouldn't know anything about. So I appreciate you. And you can catch Danny Cover 3 podcasts, CBS Sports HQ, CBS Sports Spotlight. How many days a week on Sirius?
5 days a week, every morning, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m.
Jeez. Well, thank you for staying up.
I'm going to hit you up. You're coming on next week, whether you know it or not.
I can't wait. All right. Thanks, Danny. Thanks to producer Claire. And thanks all you guys who watch, listen, and comment. We'll see you guys soon.